IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. Do you remember last year when we spoke about how the Intel vPro platform is built for business? Well, I'm glad to say we've kicked it up a notch. That's right, Intel is back with a new and improved version of the platform. The new Intel vPro platform lets you do more of what you want and less of what you don't. So it's better for you and for your IT teams, who really are the backbone of keeping your work-from-home experience easy and enjoyable. I can safely say that the new vPro platform gives you more enterprise efficiency with less constraints. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can get more done with less waiting. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleagues Anirudh and Aditya, and we're going to be talking about history. Not just about history in the sort of abstract sense, but history in terms of how it's living through the politics of today. And we've seen this over the last couple of months playing out in the West in particular, but also sort of in different parts of the world, not just in the West. And it all sort of, if you go back to the sort of Black Lives Matter movement in America that began this year after the killing of George Floyd, and sort of that reignited the controversy over old statues, roads, and that spread to different parts of the world. In Britain, they wanted to pull down statues of slave owners and slave traders. In Africa, squares were renamed. And in different parts of the world, this ignited a conversation about history and whether history in all its ugliness should be preserved and these monuments should be preserved. Do they glorify people who've committed historical atrocities, or should we be looking at letting them be there so that we can be mindful of those atrocities, or should we be looking at actually taking them down and creating new spaces which are far more inclusive? And there are different views on that. So Aditya and Anirudh, I want to sort of start off with both of you, probably Anirudh first, since you're the historian in the room today. What exactly is your thought on how should we be approaching history in this context? Should we be approaching history in sort of the context of present day politics? Or is history something that should be there in all its ugliness?
Thanks, Manoj. I both agree and disagree with the statement that history should be remembered in all its ugliness, because there are ways of remembering history which shape our consciousness of the past and thus inform the lessons that we take from it. The Black Lives Matter movement actually provides a really good example of this. Because if you look at a lot of these statues that protesters are demanding be taken down, and keep in mind, yes, there are some pretty egregious cases of them defacing the statues of civil rights activists and so on. But let's look at the general principle of what they're asking for. After the American Civil War during the Reconstruction era, there was a very profound period during which the Union tried to basically make peace with a lot of people who had fought for the Confederate side. And one major way that they did this was by kind of allowing the southern states to glorify the heroes of the Civil War, the people who had fought on their side. And a lot of these people, as you might imagine, being southern aristocrats, were deeply involved in the slave trade, had a large number of slaves. And while there might be nothing wrong in theory with remembering historical figures from the slave-owning South, if you look at the way that these statues are positioned, the places that they were positioned in, they're overwhelmingly positioned near black neighborhoods. Who was building them? These weren't necessarily often built by elected officials. If you look at Stone Mountain, I think that's what it's called, which has these massive carvings of the heroes of the Confederate movement. These were built by a group called the Daughters of the Confederacy, who were basically affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan, who, as you know, for more than a century after the end of the American Civil War, continued with extrajudicial executions of black people. And so broadly within the context of a deeply segregated racial history, if you have monuments up to people who contributed to, enforced, and benefited from that racial history within a public space paid for by public money, maintained by public money, what does it say about the representativeness of the regime that's allowing this to happen? If a very large section of your population feels oppressed by a particular historical monument, and if that same section of the population does not have the democratic means to take it down, then I think they have every right to request that they be taken down. I'm not necessarily saying that they should be pulled down by force, because that establishes a bit of a dangerous precedent. But I don't think there's anything wrong in theory with demanding that monuments to particular figures be taken down.
Aditya?
I think Anirudh makes a really important point that a lot of these statues really come up not out of some love for understanding deeper historical truths, but are driven to a great extent by contemporary political agendas. Anirudh talked about the United Daughters of the Confederacy. This is an organization of Southern white women, largely drawn from the plantation class that actually initiated the American Civil War and fought for slavery or had owned slaves previously. And not just the places where those statues are built, but even the timing coincides with some political purpose. It is essentially about keeping African Americans in place. It is about proscribing their rights. And so these monuments are not necessarily about remembering history as it was, but about the creation of certain myths. And what are these myths? If you look, if I were to simplify the historiography of the American Civil War, in the initial decades after 1865, the Confederates were seen as traitors. But in the last years of the 19th century and the beginning of the early 20th century, you see this lost cause myth being built up. The idea that this was not necessarily about slavery, that it creates this romantic notion about the South as being these simple agrarian people who are standing up for their rights, for their freedoms. And the North were all these scheming carpetbaggers who wanted to destroy their wonderful society and culture. And so it creates a heroic myth about the American Civil War, which by the way, you see in movies, you see in American Westerns. It really goes back to one of the earliest films, The Birth of a Nation. And that myth is being perpetuated by organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So I think it's important for us to understand that a lot of statue building is driven by contemporary politics. And to the extent that statues are a part of history, they are a reflection of a political agenda of some people at the time that the statue was built, not necessarily of what the statue commemorates.
I think that's a very important point, Aditya. The idea that building a particular kind of monument using the resource of a state reflects the worldview and the attempt to build a historical myth generally of a very small and highly motivated group, and not necessarily representative of a nation at large. So when Manoj was talking a little earlier about remembering the ugliness of history, now if you want to remember the Confederacy through books and talk about the ugliness of the Confederacy and the ownership of slaves, but also shed light on the fact that not all of these people can be reduced to absolutely evil caricatures, right? Certainly there may have been people even on the Confederate side who are more morally complex than we might like to imagine. But there are, as I said before, there are realms and there are ways of remembering history. There are so many different actors involved. So when a society at large determines or broadly decides that it is no longer comfortable with remembering a particular aspect of history a particular way, then I think there is absolutely a case to be made for certain monuments, even if they've been up for 100 years, to perhaps be taken down or to be presented in a different way.
I guess the challenge with all of this, I'm fairly on the fence on all of this. I don't necessarily, I don't enjoy the idea of seeing anything taken down in that sense. So, because to me, again, sets you on this slippery slope for, for lots of things to be justified. But I take the point about, what these monuments would represent and what is the political agenda, or what was the political agenda that they reflected when they were built. Because I take the point that Aditya, you were making that, this is, it is essentially reflective of the politics of the time. But if you this is the argument, right? I mean, when you see any of these things that are being built in anywhere in the world, whether it's in the US or it's in India, they will reflect the politics of the time. But what you do end up by this controversy, the fact that they exist and there exists a controversy around taking them down, in some ways, to me, it sort of takes you back to the politics of that time, right? It strengthens the argument, strengthens the reactionary forces within society. It's not like they don't exist, they exist. Yet the sort of renewed contest around this sort of strengthens reactionary forces even more. And if the argument is to sort of create a more sort of unoppressive, inclusive environment by taking down some of these pieces, you end up creating an environment which is completely the opposite. Because it's once again a charged environment, polarized environment. That's one part of what I wanted to say. The other part of what I wanted to say was the idea of a society coming together and deciding that they don't want this. That's really difficult to ascertain. How do we ascertain that a society has decided this? At the end of the day, one of the means that we have is essentially a representative government making a decision or a legislature making a decision. How otherwise do we end up making this decision?
Those are both very interesting points, Manoj. So I want to tackle the first one, the idea that protesting to take down these monuments can very often just end up strengthening reactionary forces and therefore by extension end up weakening the call for justice in a way. If you look at, for example, the mid 19th century, right, when there was a massive reform movement growing within India calling for an end to stuff like child marriage and to stuff like sati and so on, one could very well make the case that these both drastically strengthen reactionary forces. You can see another example in the 20th century, for example, when a lot of sadhus and so on were absolutely up in arms against Nehru's Hindu Code Bill. But you can't indefinitely ask an oppressed section of society to delay its call for justice for fear of strengthening a reaction from its oppressors, right? That does not adhere to the democratic principles, ideas of equality that all of our societies and polities today are ostensibly founded upon. The second point, I agree that that call is far more difficult to make, right? Because one could argue that in the first place, the way that these monuments were built was in a profoundly undemocratic way. And very often, given the fact that the classes that are building monuments tend to be the dominant classes, tend to have a lot of control over the media, to what extent is like any protest movement against them like really well founded? It's very difficult to really gauge that, and I accept that. But that said, let's say that I and like a whole bunch of people live in a neighborhood, and all of us are fanatical non-vegetarians, and we absolutely love biryani. And there's a massive statue to veg biryani that was built 100 years ago by some avowed fanatical veg biryani eaters who still control the government. What if at a local level, democratically, societies get to choose and say that, look, this is not something that we want to have in our community, this is not something that we want to have in our society, then I think there would be a stronger case for having that removed, right? If you decentralize the representation to the community level and let communities decide what they want to remember from history, rather than having it imposed upon them from an outside force, I think that might be a more egalitarian way to go around this process of remembrance.
And that potentially leads us into the challenge of, what do you do when a community decides that it wants to remember the glories of its racist past? Because essentially what it might end up happening is that cities and societies end up ghettoizing, becoming more sort of homogenous, and then those homogenous groups decide what they want to remember, and that could be another sort of challenge. I'm not saying that necessarily happens, but like I remember some of our conversations during sort of in office regarding Ananya's presentation in the past. Somebody was working with us, and she spoke about how society how homogeneous clusters tend to emerge. And so if you decentralize, you might end up having that sort of a challenge eventually also. The other thing that I wanted to sort of point out was that I agree. I don't see that people should be delaying their call for social justice just because there could be reactionary forces that could get strengthened. But it's also about the fight that you're picking. Legislative reform can have long-term tangible impact on how society is structured and how things operate. Whereas maybe renaming things, pulling down monuments will not have that impact on real lives, but will also sort of strengthen reactionary forces. So pushing through something. So I guess the argument that I'm having is that pick your fights. And pick the fight that will actually have a tangible impact on the ground as opposed to something like this. Obviously, I don't agree with the idea that you must delay your desire for justice and, live in oppression. But perhaps picking your fight is what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I think you guys have covered the instrumental arguments for and against removal of statues quite well. I'll just add that ultimately, whether we believe a statue or any such thing, whether a road should be renamed, a building should be repurposed, I think all of this ultimately depends on how bad we think that is, So I'm guessing nobody really wants a Hermann Goering statue anywhere. But you might, what about a Winston Churchill statue? What about an Edward Colston statue, the statue that was taken down in Bristol, the statue of a slave trader? And, there are people who object to Gandhi statues as well. So it really depends on political advocacy of the time and whether you are able to either convince enough people that the statue should be removed, or if you take direct action and vandalize it, knock it down, as happened with the Colston statue.
So if I can address the points that you made, Manoj, so there's two of them, right? The first being the idea that this might lead to essentially the formation of bubbles with different kind of historical monuments and radically different ideas of what historical heroes are, who should be remembered, what they represent within a city. And yes, again, like I understand that that is a risk, but again, I feel like that is a risk only in a society where public discourse has totally broken down to the point where you're no longer able to have a civil conversation and have heroes that appeal to more than one social group, right? And if you have a city where all that it takes is the construction of a statue to trigger the construction or the destruction of a statue to trigger ghettoization, then it tells you that there is something far more insidious at play in the way that civil discourse is happening, in the way that histories are being constructed and remembered, that might need to be tackled first. So in that case, the statue itself just becomes a flashpoint within a much more problematic kind of civil discourse, which I think is more important to address. Again, this is not a practical solution. It's more in the realm of theory, right? To address the theoretical point about whether this could lead to segregation. Personally, I think that the best way to solve the problem is to actually have more honest conversations about our past and to help people just more generally, broadly understand that not all historical figures are black and white, and there are no absolute heroes or absolute villains in history. And I think that America is really a great case of why this is not able to happen, precisely because that civil discourse that I was talking about has supremely deteriorated. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, the US president demanded that project to teach the history of colonial America more accurately be scrapped. He also demanded that just racial sensitivity training in federal organizations should be stopped. So that tells you a lot about why these kind of like demands kind of arise, right? In a society that is theoretically at ease with itself, or at least at ease with having these difficult conversations, understanding that the meanings attached to historical monuments can change, you would not have this problem at all. But the reason why statues are now becoming a flashpoint and why their construction and destruction have such profound meanings, not just in the US, but also in India, is because of a result of decades of a public education system which focuses on this very, if I dare say, a shallow and reductionist interpretation of national histories, which depends on these great mythological figures and seems to assume that citizens are not capable of having nuanced conversations about historical figures. So that's my take on your first point. As for the second point of choosing your battles and being tactical in terms of what you're going to demand, again, yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you. We have to remember that if we're talking about Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, we have to remember that it's a enormously diverse group of people that are participating in the protests. There isn't really a single kind of leadership, and there isn't really a single coherent set of demands. Certainly for a lot of people, those statues might be the most obvious way of venting out their anger and frustration about a system that's weighed against them. And for many others, these might not be as important as the long game. Personally, I would think that for a movement like Black Lives Matter, that is very much an example of one of these modern social media protests, right, which also kind of bleeds out into the real world. For something like this, it's very difficult to give advice to this enormously diverse group of protesters and say, hey, this is what you should be doing. Very often, from what I've seen, especially across the world, right, the reason why protesters go out into the street and start like taking out their anger and frustration on physical objects and on other people is because they are so utterly and totally fed up with the system that they think is never going to be reformed no matter what they do. You keep seeing these photographs, for example, of people who fought in the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the US, showing up for a Black Lives Matter protest today. And once again, I'd like to kind of like weave this back to my original point about how the kind of situation where we find ourselves in now is a result of decades of a particular kind of social group, or just broadly of elite institutional capture, forcing their vision of what nationalism and national history is. And for me, at least, the biggest takeaway from all these protests that are happening is not necessarily related to the erection and the destruction of particular statues, but to me really highlights the importance of having nuanced conversations about history and having materials about history be easily accessible. And when I say materials about history, I'm talking about like actual academic works on history, not the kind of stuff that you see on Quora or on Facebook, for example. And as such, it's a very, very wide-ranging problem. Again, as I said, I'm not offering solutions. I'm just analyzing the problem, and a lot of what I'm saying is purely theoretical. A lot of this is again tied to the way that social media operates and the way that politicians use social media to create identities that can be mobilized in a democratic system. So it's very complicated, rambling answer, but yeah, that's what I have to say.
Again, if you look at the instrumentality, the utility of taking down statues, through direct action, of course, the big problem is that the other side can pay back in kind. While these movements are very diverse and frequently leaderless, there is a problem with taking down statues by yourself rather than by, say, a local body or a town council deciding to take it down, because you don't know exactly where it's going to lead. But the good thing that I'm really glad that Anirudh brought up this whole thing about having nuanced conversations about history, because our options are not leaving statues as they are or destroying them. There are lots of other ways you can go about this. One is, of course, India has, I think, actually handled this fairly well. We have taken down a lot of statues of British leaders, of British rulers from specific public places. We haven't defaced them. We haven't destroyed them, which, they just kept somewhere else discreetly. A lot of other places where the statues are not so intrusive, we've actually left the statues alone. In our own city where we are, Bangalore, there's a statue of Queen Victoria right at Cubbon Park at one of its entrances. And nobody seems to be terribly bothered. And I think that India is able to do that, especially with the colonial period, because the colonial period is not necessarily part of culture wars within India. I talked about the statue of Edward Colston. People decided to take down the statue of the slave trader because the ghosts of that are still felt today. Because the impact of that man, of the actions of that time are still felt today among black minorities in the UK who feel disenfranchised. Nobody is planning to take down a statue of that genocidal maniac and slave trader named Julius Caesar because nobody cares about it anymore, right? So I think that really matters. But, just getting back to the point of what you can do in a public space, if you look at Trafalgar Square, the center of London with Nelson's column, Nelson is a great maritime hero. He's completely attached, he's completely integral to the UK's national identity, and understandably so. But this man also defended the slave trade. So how do you make sense of that? Well, I think that the way out is to contextualize. There's no reason why Trafalgar Square only needs to have Nelson's column. It can have statues or, any other kind of structure that contextualizes Nelson, that puts him in his historical context and encourages intelligent, nuanced conversation about the man, about the times, about British imperial history. Again, India has managed to do this to some extent. If you look at the environs of Delhi, you do have memorials and statues built by the British in the late 19th century, commemorating their, heroes and quotes from the mutiny or revolt of 1857-58. The Indian government has not gone and destroyed these, defaced these, removed them. What they have done is contextualize. What they have done is built adjacent structures that bring forth a sort of Indian point of view about what these events are all about. So I think that is entirely possible. And it is, I think, for a child going to these places and seeing these different points of views, I think that's enormously educational. And so we are not stuck between these two extremes of destroying statues or just letting them be. Now, as far as removing statues and, where do you put them next? India just leaves them out in open air, in fenced up areas. Some people say, well, you can move these statues to indoor museums. The problem is a lot of these statues are meant for the outdoors. They're pretty huge. They literally don't actually fit into a lot of museums, existing museums. So it's hard for museums to take them. So I think there needs to be a conversation about how we can recontextualize what to do when we remove a statue. Where does it go? The idea is not to destroy the statue. The idea is to contextualize it in aid of a better understanding of history.
That's absolutely fascinating. I think that's an ideal way to sort of call this conversation to a close. I think it's really, really interesting that you spoke about how India has actually managed this well in the past. And one really hopes that, we do that, which is something that we're not doing at the moment. But I really hope that we do that going forward and learn from what we've done in the past well, rather than actually going down roads which are far more problematic.
Yeah, and I think that also calls attention to the fact that academic historians need to be taken far more seriously than they are. I don't think this is an issue just with India, but more broadly with the world at large. A part of this I think one of the results of the proliferation of social media is that everybody's an expert now, right? And especially politicians who have don't have the best academic credentials at the best of times are now seen as the best arbiters of what actually happened and what a society deserves to remember and how it should remember it. And I think that, as Aditya was saying, contextualizing, I think that also includes making academic works accessible and understandable and intelligible to the general public, which also involves better funding for museums, better funding for public historians, better funding just generally for archaeology and history in general is really the need of the hour.
Yeah, I think the challenge has become that our discourse has become about punchlines and headlines as opposed to nuance. And, and nuance will never make good headlines. So we have to find ways to make it far more engaging for people to actually sit through it, and to make sense of things.
I'll just add one last thing, Manoj, which is that just in case we feel too good about ourselves, I think we've handled colonial period history better simply because it's not part of our cultural wars. On the other hand, the so-called Muslim period, medieval India, from about 1000 AD to about 1800 AD, is far more controversial. People want to rename an Aurangzeb road, and so on. There are all of these controversies, which I think continue to remain unresolved in India. So it will be quite interesting going ahead.
Yeah, and at present it seems like we've resolved our colonial, past, we've resolved it. It's not part of our culture. Who knows? 50 years, 70 years down the road, geopolitics changes and things change.
Yeah, my favorite repurposed building of all time may be the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. This was a Chalcedonian Christian church built in 537. It then became a Greek Orthodox church. Then after the Fourth Crusade, when the so-called Latin occupation, it became a Roman Catholic church for about 50 or 60 years. And then it returned to being a Greek Orthodox church. After 1453, the Ottoman conquest, it became a mosque. In 1931, if I'm not mistaken, it was, under the secular regime of Mustafa Kemal, it became a museum. And this year, the Turks have tried to repurpose it once again as a mosque.
Under the new Ottoman regime of President Erdogan.
Yeah. All right. So with that, we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much, both of you. And thank you so much for listening to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel. It's been a great week on the network this week. If you haven't been paying attention, please do listen to some of the shows. We had Chetan Bhagat. This was the first returning guest on Cyrus Says. Do check that out. Great episode. We had Palak Zatakia on Advertising is Dead. Really interesting conversation was had with Varun. We had another crossover on the habit codes. Zarina Poonawala showed up over there to have a discussion with Ashton about anxiety and pressure. Begin the Journey with Ashish Vidyarthi continues to kill it. Please definitely do check it out. An old friend, Vijay Koshi, was on Storytellers and Storysellers. Do check that out as well. And I'd like to mention one thing. If you're a Tamil speaker, you should definitely check out our podcast, Kadai Podcast Punyan Selvan. Kavita Jiva has done a fantastic job to finish up her first story. It is the last episode which just came out last Monday. Do check it out if you speak Tamil. It is an incredible achievement. Please do check that out. And with that, hope to see you again next week.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey, available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.